Hello and welcome to episode 83 of Linux After Dark. I'm Joe.
I'm Chris.
I'm Gary.
And I'm Dalton.
Welcome back, chaps. I went to WordCamp recently, and for the first time there was a swaps table. The idea was people would just dump their old crap, and as long as someone took it away by the end of the day, they didn't have to take it home with them. And someone left some SSDs, including a 240 gigabyte SanDisk SSD Plus. I thought, I am having that. So that went straight in my bag. And that made me think, what if I combined that with all my other janky old hard drives and SSDs and made the world's worst RAID array and NAS? And then I said to you lot, right, this is a challenge. Who can make the worst RAID array? And the mantra for this is, what would Jim and Allan from 2.5 Admins not do?
I don't have the largest array, but I do have the jankiest.
Do you? I don't think you're going to beat me.
I guarantee you I am going to win here.
Right, well, I may as well start then, because I had the least worst RAID array, because I have followed my own advice and thrown away all of the bad, horrible storage devices. But it still turned out horrible somehow. So the only spare drives I have that I can at all rely on that don't have data on that I want to preserve were 2 brand new in-box 512 gig NVMe drives.
How did you end up with 2 brand new NVMe drives that you're not using?
Amazon Prime Day about a year ago where they were about 30 quid. And I bought them because I was like, they'll be useful. And then they sat in the drawer for a year.
And then they turned out to be incredibly useful for this. So that's good.
They did, yes. So my strategy here was, can I hook them up to the worst machine that I can connect them to and somehow produce the worst RAID array? Turns out that I also had a clear out recently, courtesy of the OggCamp swaps table, where I gave away my beloved ThinkPad T400, so hopefully that's found a good new home. And the oldest machine I had with USB 3 was a 2013 MacBook Pro. But this was the crap tier 2013 MacBook Pro with only 4 gigabytes of RAM. So it was 4 gigs of RAM and a 4th gen ultra low voltage i5. So not a great machine then. Really, really not a great machine now. But it does run Ubuntu very well, as it turns out.
And that's soldered 4 gigs, isn't it?
Oh yeah, there's no upgrading that machine at all. You could put a bigger internal SSD in it with one of those adapters to convert the Apple proprietary format to NVMe, but there's literally no point. It's a useless laptop.
I forgot to mention at the beginning of this, the rules were only one machine was allowed.
Oh, fuck.
Yeah, I had a really good idea for some jankiness involving iSCSI, because turns out I do have lots of machines that could be an iSCSI box.
Well, I just lose then.
But Joe said no, so my idea of lots of distributed iSCSI with my awful Mac as a head end for that didn't come true. So yeah, ended up with these 2 NVMe disks in USB enclosures connected over USB 3.0, so 5 gigabit per second, theoretically, to the Mac. And it was horrible, basically. I was kind of going through on our Telegram group that we have behind the scenes with Chris to make sure I hadn't done anything stupid. And using our standardized FIO run, I was able to get 17 megabytes per second write and about 5 megabytes per second read off of NVMe disks connected over USB.
Did you do a ZFS mirror then?
I tried a whole combination of things. So I did a ZFS mirror. I did a just ZFS stripe of the 2 disks. I even tried doing an L2 arc with a raw file on the internal SSD to try and get a little bit more performance out of it, because the internal SSD in that thing is actually fairly decent in terms of speed. I tried with just extended 4 on a single disk, and whatever I did with our FIO test that we were all doing could not get decent performance out of it. However, if I just tried to DD a file off of one of those SSDs, no matter what file system it was running, to the internal disk, I could get 100 plus megabytes a second, which is about what I'd expect.
Did you try using it as an actual NAS, like streaming media off them?
Yeah, and that seemed fine. Like day-to-day real-world performance on those disks seemed okay. I could connect to it with SSHFS over a gigabit network with a Thunderbolt to network adapter. Everything was fine. It was just for some reason, as soon as I did any FIO run on it, it topped out at that somewhere between 5 and 7 megabytes a second.
So I did read actually earlier today, Gary, that specific MacBook has problems with its USB ports, like flaky hardware that's known to be a problem. So you might have hit something along those lines, because my machine was of a similar vintage with similar spec USB 3 ports, and I got better performance in mine, and I wasn't even using NVMe. So interesting. But I do think something is amiss there, because you should have got better results.
Dang it. I knew I should have gone and grabbed a Wise 5070 off the stack.
Well, if it's one root hub and you're splitting everything between all the devices on the root hub, you start to run out of bandwidth pretty quick.
But it's not, though. It's a dedicated root hub for the 2 external USB ports. So all of the internal stuff sits on its own USB 2 controller. So not that.
It's just bad. Okay.
Yeah, like Chris said, clearly just something rubbish. Yeah.
It's weird, isn't it? It's already starting to sound like this was a terrible idea.
And this was the most simple setup that I could possibly think of. 2 USB connected SSDs on a laptop. What could go wrong?
It must be that USB controller somehow in the Mac.
It's got to be. Maybe I'll try these disks on another machine and report back in a future episode.
So I just learned that I cheated.
Yeah, so how many machines were involved with yours then?
2, because
Okay.
I don't know when you said one machine is allowed. Maybe I read it and just didn't completely process what you were saying. But so consider this, right? You've got your array that ends up being like 128 gigabytes. But what happens if a tree falls on your house and it takes out your array? Of course you could go back to backups, but that'll take too long. What if you could just bring up the array on either side of a network link? And because apparently I forgot that iSCSI exists, have any of you ever heard of NBD?
No.
No, sounds like it's no big deal though.
It might be a big deal when I tell you that it's network block device.
Right, okay.
All right, so the situation here is, on either side of the mirror over network block device, you can bring up your Z pool and just have the data that you had before the tree hit your house.
So what, you've got 2 physical machines with 2 sets of storage that are physically separate?
Yes, so because I also don't have anything with a lot of USB ports for one, or anything at all, I had my Surface Pro 4, which has a single USB port, and an internal 256 gigabyte SSD. And I plugged a boot SSD in via USB and used the internal storage as the disk that it was sharing over the network. And then in the Raspberry Pi that I used, I put the boot media on the micro SD card and attached a SATA SSD over USB 3.0.
Which Pi? What generation?
4.
Okay, so not too janky.
And then I hooked both of them up to my network. Of course, I went over Wi-Fi once and over coaxial twice, because now I get to say that I'm one of the only people who has run a ZFS Z pool over coaxial. And I don't mean any of that replication shit. I mean the Z pool's running over coaxial.
That's still a better network than Virgin Media in the UK, by the way, I'd like to interject.
So, long story short, I maxed out 9 megabytes per second with 2300 IOPS.
Ooh, nice and speedy.
And I don't know what was wrong with it, because I could see the system with the remote disk was receiving it like 26 megabytes per second, but I guess that only translates into a third of that-ish.
And again, did you try using it as a proper network storage device? Like, did you stream media off it, for example?
Well, no, I didn't use it as a NAS. It wasn't going to work. The total weight listed by ZFS was like 1 second per read. So I'm pretty sure any streaming algorithm would have just fallen over.
Yeah, this sounds very similar to what I was going to do with iSCSI. I was just basically going to put an iSCSI host on every machine in the house and then basically connect them from one box and present that as a massive Z pool, which, again, clearly wouldn't have worked, particularly with various constrained links in the house that are already only 1 gig uplinks. But it felt like a cool idea.
It would have worked, I think we've proven. It just would have been bad.
Well, you did cheat, but that is pretty janky. So I still think I'm going to win, though, because mine is definitely worse. Okay, this episode is sponsored by 1Password. Imagine your company's security like the quad of a college campus. There are nice brick paths between the buildings. Those are company-owned devices, IT-approved apps, and managed employee identities. And then there are the paths people actually use, the shortcuts worn through the grass that are the actual straightest line from point A to B. Those are unmanaged devices, shadow IT apps, and non-employee identities like contractors. Most security tools only work on those happy brick paths, but a lot of security problems take place on the shortcuts. 1Password Extended Access Management is the first security solution that brings all these unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under your control. It ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. 1Password Extended Access Management solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. It's security for the way we work today, and it's now generally available to companies with Okta and Microsoft Entra, and in beta for Google Workspace customers. So support the show and check it out at onepassword.com/LinuxAfterDark. That's onepassword.com/LinuxAfterDark. Quick bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to linuxafterdark.net/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can email show@linuxafterdark.net.
Okay, so mine is a little bit of a development of Gary's, I think. I don't have a lot of storage laying about either. I have similarly had a purge. The only storage I've got is in use, and I couldn't offload it elsewhere, and I didn't have unlimited time to set this up. So then I opened a drawer and I found pristine Kingston data traveler flash drives. And I paused and thought, no, this can't be a good idea. So I immediately thought, right, has anyone ever set up RAID on flash drives? Because they are just notoriously bad. And in fact, someone has. I found a blog post and I thought, okay, let's just give this a go. So I had a 2nd gen Latitude. It's the one I always use for challenges and testing distros. And it has 8 gigs of RAM. And it's fine. It still sort of works. And to get a baseline, I had a SATA SSD inside. And then I hooked up a SATA SSD to one of the USB 3 ports. And then I did various testing across that. So I set up just a single disk partition of ext4, F2FS, ButterFS, and ZFS. And then I set up a mirror of all of them. So like a RAID 1 in ext4, F2FS. And yeah, largely I got pretty decent results. And this is the FIO test, by the way, that everyone else is talking about. So I got like 33 megabytes a second on a single ext4 disk for reads and around 100 for writes. But that was just, I wanted to know what the machine was like with good storage over USB before I descended into the hell of flash disks. So I already knew this was a bad idea when I got a 4-port Anchor unpowered USB hub and then plugged 4 32 gigabyte Kingston Data Traveler flash drives into it. But I plugged 2 in, and then the third one wouldn't fit in because they were too fat. But that didn't deter me. I got a extension so that I could plug that in and then get the 4 drives. So I had 4 bus-powered flash drives. And I was like, I turned on the laptop and thought, I'm not sure these are even all going to power on, and they might just complain. But they have lights on them, which made this much more entertaining. Because as I said in our chat, like digital screaming, when I was putting them through all of this, these red lights would flash on and off. So I did the same thing, but I had 4 disks. So I did 2 mirrors in ZFS and in ButterFS. And I tried to do RAID 10 in ext4 and F2FS, but I gave up because I couldn't assemble the array on those file systems in that disk layout. It looked like it was working, and this became a common theme. If you've ever DD'd an ISO to one of these really terrible drives, you must have experienced that thing where it looks quite fast, and then it screeches to a terrible speed. And then when you run a sync to flush the file system buffers, it takes ages.
Yeah, always do an and sync
with
a DD.
Exactly. because these drives are CAC. Like, they are designed to write to distribute something, and you go through the pain of writing it, and then you just throw the disk at someone, and the read speed is acceptable. But they are not designed for these workloads at all. So I didn't manage to get a RAID set up in ext4 and F2FS, but I did manage to get a RAID set up on ButterFS and ZFS across the 4 drives, and it was absolutely terrible. But what I would say is Joe's question so far has been, did you try and use it as a NAS? And I did. I pulled every single res of Big Buck Bunny, because that's what you always use for this, up to the highest bitrate 4K that you can download. And then I got my phone out and I just set up a simple direct SSHFS connection from my phone, and I opened all the video files in VLC. I saw the lights flash up and I was like, it's never going to make it. But I promise you, for every bitrate on ZFS and ButterFS on a quad disk flash array, there was no buffering or stuttering, and it didn't stop. So that's not a victory. You should never do this ever. But I was literally expecting to say, right, I've fucked the laptop and I've fucked the hub and all 4 drives by the end of this. The fact that they're still in the land of the living is an achievement in itself, as far as I'm concerned.
I'm just wondering how long something like a scrub would have taken that RAID.
You put them all on the same root board.
I did do a scrub, Gary, but not of very much data. But I cannot tell you how much fun it is to throw something at the array and just watch 4 drives scream into life. And I was like, one of them is surely going to give up the ghost. But yeah, assembling the array, the traditional RAID array on traditional file systems was hilarious, because I was catting proc MD stat and thinking, okay, this is going to take a while. I only did it, I think, on ext4. And after about 40 minutes of leaving the computer and coming back, it was still going, but then it got to 99%. And then I realized I had hit the same effect as when you DD an ISO.
Oh, it just loaded up your buffers and you were just waiting.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure if I just left the machine on for ages, it might have just about finished, but what sort of usable state that would have been in. And to round off in a conclusion, I did draw up some graphs, which I shared in our group. I think I shared them with the headline, "Today in Things That Shock Absolutely No One," because the latency on those flash drives is absolutely terrible. So yeah, if anyone thinks this is a good idea and they're going to give it a go, I mean, if you want to learn, then you can, but just do it in a VM. Just make virtual disks. Like, this is a very silly thing to do.
Don't even do that. Just build a ZFS array with like raw files or something. Just truncate -s file. Like, you don't even need a VM.
But Big Buck Bunny worked, Gary, so we can put this into prod straight away.
Success.
Well, I was able to stream 4K video off my janky NAS, so therefore what I'm about to tell you about is definitely a good idea and everyone should do this. So, what I did was I dug out my first gen i7 desktop machine, which I think has got 8 SATA ports in it. And then I got together all of the storage that I was willing to kind of chuck at this. So I've got a 6 terabyte Barracuda, which is a SMR drive with bad sectors. I've got a 1 terabyte Barracuda, which I connected via USB.
USB 3 or USB 2?
Well, I think most of the USB connections were 2 because it's only got a couple of USB 3 connectors on the motherboard. So yeah, most of my USB that I'm going to talk about here is USB 2. So what else? A couple of cheap 120 gigabyte SATA SSDs. A nice Once Upon a Time Evo 840, 120 gigabyte. Obviously that 240 gigabyte SSD that I got from OggCamp. Some USB hard drives. A 3 terabyte Toshiba SATA drive with bad sectors. WD Black NVMe via USB. And various other stuff, including a 64 gigabyte Evo Plus micro SD card via USB. I thought I'll really put a cat amongst the pigeons there.
You put the nicest drive on USB?
Yeah, well, it doesn't have NVMe. This is first gen i7. It's an i7 870.
Yep.
And so with it all connected, it was only drawing 12.9 watts.
Well, that doesn't sound right.
before I turned it on. And then idling 88 watts, and then under some load, 110 watts.
That's still better than I thought.
It's better than I thought, to be honest, as well, because that i7 is hungry. And because there's no graphics on that there's no graphics on this motherboard. I had to have, it's like an old, I can't remember, NVIDIA passively cooled GPU, which doesn't help the power load as well. So yeah, I just had ridiculous numbers of disks, 13 all told. And I was booting off a flash drive as well. Actually quite a nice SanDisk Extreme flash drive, but nonetheless, that's where the boot drive was. So I just used all of the SATA. Oh yeah, and to get more SATA ports, I used a PCIe card. So I got 2 more SATA ports out of that. But I ran out of power connectors in the end. I considered using a second PSU, but I thought I might kill myself if I do that. So
just for redundancy, Joe, this is a professional rig. You've got to.
Yeah, I just thought, no, let's not do that. So I actually could have had 1 more SATA, but I just didn't have the power for it. And I thought, what would Jim and Allan not do? Well, they wouldn't do any of this, but they definitely wouldn't install ButterFS RAID 1 on it. So that's exactly what I did.
Across all 13 disks.
Yeah. And so the command is so funny. It's like sudo makefs.butterfs-m RAID1-d, and then /dev/SDA, SDB, SDC, SDD, all the way up to SDN. I've never seen SDN for Norman before. It was fine though. That's the weird thing. Although it was really weird. I'd start copying a massive file and it would be going at like 4 gigabit, like, 100-ish megabytes a second. And then it would just like drop to 6 for a bit. And then the USB adapter that the micro SD card was in would start flashing. Oh, right. It's right into that now. Okay. And then it'd go back up to 100. And it was otherwise fine though. When I tried to play back a 4K video, it just played back absolutely fine. And it was only when I did these FIO benchmarks on it that it became clear that latency was a massive problem with this, as you would expect. And had I had any more than one user trying to stream video off it or just interact with it in any way, it would have just completely fallen over. Whereas my NAS with the 2 18 terabyte Exos drives in it, I mean, you couldn't tell the difference from interacting with it just as a single user. But when you do these benchmarks, you realize that the latency was like in the microseconds on my proper NAS versus like hundreds of milliseconds on the janky NAS.
I've got to say, Joe set the challenge, and I think Joe fulfilled the challenge with 13
Joe
drives.
won.
Yes.
Well, I did rig this game. I knew that I had drawers full of this shit, so it was pretty obvious that I was going to win.
Wait, didn't that happen last time too?
It's almost like there's a pattern here.
Joe's hoarding tendencies win every time.
Yeah, just never throw anything away, and then you'll always win the cool challenges.
Well, initially, we were lucky because initially Joe sent a picture of the motherboard and said, "Is this an IDE port?" And I was like, "Yes, it is, Joe."
I could not find an IDE cable because I did have Molex connectors, so I could have done it, but I just couldn't find an IDE cable.
And you still have IDE drives in your drawers?
I've got one, I think.
Good Lord.
You just never know, do you? I'll throw it out and then I'll need it the next week.
Yeah, I've often thought if I throw out an IDE drive that I'll definitely need it.
No, we can't become a safe space for hoarders.
I don't need an intervention. This is not an intervention. I win. I'm the best.
I did once have a client in my business come to me and their mother had passed away and they said, "Can you recover data from her computer? I'm not sure when she last turned it on." And I'm not joking. I took the side panel off. It was one of those Dimension Dells, with the flap for the USB ports, the grey and black ones, really old. And I opened the side and it was like the inside of a pillow of dust. Like I just moved a rectangle of dust the shape of a pillow and it was an IDE drive. And I was like, this has surely no chance. It'd been parked. But I got all the data off it and it was fine.
Yeah, I've still got some old IDE drives around that are in machines that I'm pretty confident I could pull off the shelf and boot up tomorrow. See the Pentium 2 machine that I've featured in these challenges many times.
Yeah, you should have done that and then you would have won by default.
Yeah, but it has no SATA ports, and I'm not going to go and buy a SATA PCI card just to one-up you.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Chris.
I've been Gary.
I forgot that iSCSI exists.
See you later.